Most countries in Asia feel crowded. Too many people, too little space. But in the middle of it all, there's a country that feels strangely silent. Roads with no traffic, forests with no cities, a country almost the size of the UK with fewer people than London. This isn't because Laos was destroyed. It wasn't abandoned and it wasn't forgotten. In fact, Laos has been like this for centuries. And once you understand why Laos is so empty, you'll realize this wasn't an accident. It was inevitable. From above, Laos barely looks inhabited. Endless green forests stretch to the horizon, mountains fold into one another without interruption, rivers snake through the land untouched by cities. Highways cut across the country, but almost no one is on them. If you were flying over Laos for the first time, you might think this place was abandoned. But it wasn't. Laos isn't empty because something went wrong recently. It didn't lose its people. It never had them to begin with. On paper, Laos shouldn't feel this quiet. The country is roughly the same size as the United Kingdom, similar land area, comparable distance from coast to border. But while the UK is home to nearly 70 million people, Laos has just over 7 million. That's not a small difference, that's a different reality. 10 times fewer people spread across mountains, forests, and river valleys, and suddenly emptiness becomes the dominant feature of the landscape. And this emptiness becomes even more striking when you look around. To the east, Vietnam, dense cities, packed deltas, motorbikes filling every street. To the west, Thailand, highways glowing at night, megacities pulling people inward. Even Cambodia, scarred by one of the most brutal periods in modern history, is far more densely populated than Laos. Yet in between them all sits a country that feels like it opted out of the crowd. The usual explanations don't fully work here. It's not that Laos is poor. Poorer countries can still be crowded. It's not that Laos had massive wars that wiped out its population. Other nations suffered worse and recovered. And it's not that people don't want to live here. Lao culture, land, and community have endured for centuries. So why does it feel like no one ever arrived? Why didn't Laos experience the population explosions that transformed its neighbors? Why didn't cities grow, industries cluster, or migration accelerate? Because what you're seeing isn't a country that emptied out, you're seeing a country that never filled up. And that's the real illusion. The emptiness of Laos makes it feel like something is missing, like something was lost, like history erased a population that should be here. But the truth is more unsettling. Millions of people didn't leave Laos, they simply never came. And the biggest reason for that has nothing to do with war, ideology, or poverty. It has to do with something far more fundamental, something that shaped where people could live long before modern borders even existed. To understand why Laos is so empty, you have to stop looking at maps and start looking at terrain. Because from the ground, Laos is not open land, it's resistance. Nearly 3/4 of the country is mountainous or hilly, ridges rise sharply, valleys are narrow, flat land is rare and precious. This matters more than it sounds. Civilizations don't spread evenly, they expand where land allows them to. Look at the world's population centers: the North China Plain, the Indo-Gangetic Plain, the Mekong and Red River deltas, wide, flat areas where farming, transport, and cities can scale. Laos has almost none of that. Instead, its geography breaks people into pockets: small river valleys, isolated basins, communities separated by mountains rather than connected by plains. Even today, many Lao villages are closer to a river than to a road, and that brings us to the Mekong. The Mekong River isn't just a feature of Laos, it's the reason most people live where they do. Over 2/3 of the population lives in the Mekong corridor and its tributaries. This strip of land is flatter, more fertile, and easier to move through. Outside of it, settlement drops off dramatically. Forests thicken, elevation rises, accessibility collapses. Now compare that to Laos' neighbors. Vietnam has long coastlines and massive river deltas. Thailand has a central plain that acts like a population magnet. Cambodia has the Tonle Sap system, one of the most productive inland fisheries on earth. Laos has mountains. And mountains don't just limit farming, they limit everything. Transport becomes expensive, infrastructure becomes slow, markets stay small and fragmented. It's hard to build roads, harder to build railways, and nearly impossible to create large integrated cities. This is why Laos never developed population gravity. People didn't concentrate, they scattered. And when people scatter, something crucial never happens: scale. No massive agricultural surplus, no industrial clustering, no urban explosions. Even today, much of Laos remains heavily forested, not because it was preserved intentionally, but because it was never practical to clear at scale. The land didn't invite people in, it pushed them apart. And this geographic reality shaped everything that followed. When trade routes expanded, Laos sat off to the side. When cities grew, Laos stayed rural. When populations boomed elsewhere, Laos stayed slow and localized. So the emptiness you see today isn't modern. It's ancient, written into the mountains, carved by rivers, and forced by terrain. But geography alone doesn't tell the full story, because even difficult land can fill up if cities emerge to pull people in. And that's where the next problem begins. People don't move to countries, they move to cities. Cities are magnets. They pull workers, capital, ideas, and ambition into one place, and once that pull starts, it compounds. Laos never developed that pull. Even today, the largest city in Laos, Vientiane, feels more like a large town than a capital. Its population is smaller than many districts in Bangkok or Ho Chi Minh City. There are no megacities here, no industrial hubs that explode outward, no dense urban cores absorbing millions from the countryside. And without cities, population growth stays slow and scattered. To understand why this matters, look at Laos' neighbors again. Bangkok didn't just grow because Thailand had people. People moved to Thailand because Bangkok existed. The same is true for Hanoi, for Ho Chi Minh City, for Phnom Penh. Cities create gravity. They reward density. Factories cluster, services expand, jobs multiply. Once a city crosses a certain threshold, growth becomes self-reinforcing. Laos never crossed that threshold. Historically, Lao settlements formed as river towns and royal centers, important but small. They were administrative nodes, not industrial engines. Then came the colonial era. While French colonial authorities invested heavily in ports, plantations, and cities in Vietnam and Cambodia, Laos remained peripheral. There was no coastline to exploit, no export hub to justify large-scale infrastructure, no reason in colonial logic to build big cities here. So Laos entered the modern era without urban foundations. And once the window for early industrial urbanization closed, catching up became extremely difficult. Because cities don't appear overnight. They require dense labor pools, reliable transport, capital concentration, markets big enough to sustain them. Laos had none of these at scale. Instead of urban migration, something else happened. People left. For decades, Laotians have migrated to Thailand in search of work, not permanently but cyclically. Thailand's cities absorbed the pressure that Laos cities never could. This prevented explosive urban growth at home. Why crowd in Vientiane when Bangkok is just across the river? As a result, Laos remained rural not because people resisted cities, but because cities never became irresistible. And this creates a feedback loop. No big cities means fewer jobs means less migration means no population concentration. The country stays quiet. So when you look at Laos and feel that strange absence, that sense of space where people should be, what you're really saying is a country that never urbanized. Not because it failed, but because the forces that create cities never aligned. And this brings us to the deeper question. Why didn't those forces ever arrive in Laos? That answer lies not in geography or urban planning, but in history. Laos didn't fall behind because it collapsed. It fell behind because it arrived late and then stopped moving. For most of history, the region that is now Laos existed on the margins of larger powers. Kingdoms rose and fell, but none turned Laos into a population hub. Trade passed nearby, not through it. Empires expanded around it, not into it. And then the modern world accelerated. Global trade networks expanded, industrialization reshaped societies, populations exploded where factories, ports, and railways appeared. Laos missed that moment. As a landlocked country with no coastline, Laos never became part of the early global trade routes that transformed Southeast Asia. Vietnam had ports, Thailand had access to maritime trade, Cambodia had river systems linked to the sea. Laos had mountains. So when colonial powers arrived, their priorities were clear. The French invested heavily in Vietnam, ports, railways, plantations, cities. Cambodia received administrative and commercial centers. Laos remained an afterthought. There was no economic incentive to build large infrastructure here, no reason to industrialize a country that couldn't easily export goods. So Laos entered the 20th century with minimal urban development, weak transport networks, a largely rural economy. Then came the Cold War. Between the 1960s and 1970s, Laos became one of the most heavily bombed countries per capita in history, not because it was a major battlefield, but because it sat between others. Infrastructure that barely existed was destroyed, rural populations were displaced, development froze. While neighbors rebuilt and industrialized, Laos was trying to stabilize. After the war, Laos adopted a centralized socialist system that prioritized control and stability over rapid growth. Private industry was limited, foreign investment was cautious, urbanization slowed even further. This wasn't total failure, but it was delay, and delay in economics compounds. By the time Laos began opening up in the late 1980s and 1990s, the region had already changed. Manufacturing supply chains had formed elsewhere, cities had already claimed their roles, migration flows had settled into patterns that bypassed Laos entirely. Thailand became the regional magnet, Vietnam became the factory floor, Laos remained peripheral. Not ruined, just late. And once population momentum is lost, it's incredibly hard to recreate. People don't move to places without opportunity. Companies don't invest where markets are small. Cities don't grow where people don't arrive. So history didn't empty Laos, it froze it at a critical moment and the world moved on. But here's the twist. Even now, with peace, stability, and development slowly improving, Laos remains empty, which means something deeper is at work, something structural. And that's what we need to understand next. By now, the emptiness of Laos no longer feels mysterious. It feels logical. Geography limited where people could live. History delayed when growth could happen. And the absence of cities removed the magnet that pulls populations together. But here's the crucial part. These forces didn't disappear. They locked in. Modern Laos is stable, peaceful, culturally rich, and yet its population remains one of the lowest in the region because emptiness, once established, becomes structural. Infrastructure follows people, not the other way around. Investment follows markets, and markets follow density. Laos has none of these at scale. Roads are improving, but distances remain vast. Electricity reaches more villages, but industries stay small. Education expands, but graduates often leave. Not because Laos failed them, but because Thailand, Vietnam, and even China offer dense opportunity clusters that Laos cannot easily replicate. So the country leaks people instead of accumulating them. And there is another factor most analyses ignore. Laos doesn't need to be crowded to function. Its economy relies heavily on hydropower, mining, forestry, regional transit, agriculture. These sectors don't require megacities or massive populations. In fact, many of them work better with fewer people. Dams need rivers, not workers. Mines need capital, not crowds. Forests need space. So unlike countries chasing manufacturing-led growth, Laos isn't structurally pressured to urbanize rapidly. Its incentives are different, and culturally, rural life still dominates. Large families spread across villages, strong local ties, limited internal migration. Population growth exists, but it's slow, dispersed, and quiet, which means Laos doesn't experience explosions. It experiences continuity. So when outsiders look at Laos and ask, why is this place so empty? They're assuming emptiness is a problem waiting to be solved. But in Laos, emptiness is the outcome of alignment. Geography agrees with history, history agrees with economics, economics agrees with incentives. That doesn't mean Laos will stay frozen forever. Better infrastructure could shift patterns, regional integration could bring new roles, cities could grow slowly. But Laos is unlikely to ever resemble Thailand or Vietnam. And that's the real conclusion. Laos isn't underpopulated because it failed to grow. It's underpopulated because the world never asked it to. And in a region defined by congestion, noise, and density, Laos remains something rare. Space, silence, and a country that never filled up because it was never meant to. Thanks for watching, mate, and a bundle of thanks for hitting the subscribe button.